Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Gong, the podcast hosting conversations about the earliest stages of startup sales and all the fun stories that come from companies with little cash, no precedence, and lots of guts. My name is Adriel, and I've led sales at multiple companies, twice as CEO, twice as head of sales, and always with a love for the job and a fondness for fun stories. Currently, I lead sales at self-driving delivery car company Udelv. I love startup history, scrappy sales and stories, and I'm excited to learn them and share them with you. Our guest today is Carthele Kelly. Carthele started selling pharmaceuticals, one of the largest, most interesting field sales machines in the world. He moved into tech sales shortly thereafter, and as the first hire at LeadGenius, he grew into head of sales, and more recently as director of sales development at Zenefits, where he hired dozens of sales reps for his teams. Throughout, he has been a mentor at famed Accelerator 500 startups, teaching hundreds of founders all about early stage sales. Cart and I spent a lot of time on specific stories and strategies that he implemented before we really take things to a higher level. So it was really great to get into the nitty-gritty and the details, and I hope you enjoy this episode with Carthele Kelly. Cart, welcome to The Gong.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to be here in this beautiful room, these cozy chairs.
Very cozy.
I wanted to start by asking what you learned from one of the largest sales organizations, movements in the history of commercial capitalism, the pharmaceutical industry.
So what I learned, that was my first experience in sales, a company called Smith & Nephew. It was a great training program. That's one of the reasons that I chose it. And then, so one of the things I learned from the individual who ran the program, and I say it to a lot of people on my team, is just in terms of a sales motion to quote unquote never call the baby ugly. Which essentially means if somebody's using a particular product or they already have a solution in place that you're selling against, some folks will kind of attack that and point to all the flaws. But it was something that within the medical device field, especially with being younger and selling into guys that have been practicing for 30 years or so, making sure that you weren't kind of talking poorly upon the way that they do things. And so learning that early on is definitely something that I took away with me.
So now when you're on all these, now later on selling for the last decade of your career at larger tech companies and all that, we're disrupting everything, we're changing the way the worlds work. How do you have conversations with clients and with prospects about the, perhaps their baby's not ugly, but perhaps it's a little out of style?
Yeah, it's a fine line and just a gentle approach, taking more of a consultative sale. So if somebody's using something, like when I was at LeadGenius, if they were using another data vendor, making sure that, mentioning it, I'm familiar with that company and I've heard great things, and then kind of slowly leading to how they're using it. Are there any pain points that they have with it? What's their favorite part about it? And ultimately, before getting off that call, if you know the company well, then making sure to kind of equip them with questions to ask the vendor. That especially I found that valuable if you're in a competitive situation and they haven't purchased yet.
Can you tell me a little more about that? How do you try to, perhaps this is the wrong phrasing, but you're not exactly pitting the prospect against their current vendor, but you are asking them to look for holes in their system. How do you approach that, and how do you do so both amicably, because you're the one that you want them to trust you and you want them to know that you've got their best interest no matter where it is, but also it is a little bit competitive, and when you're at a startup like LeadGenius, there's a lot of competition. It's do or die. So how do you balance that? And perhaps for context, it would be helpful to know kind of what LeadGenius did.
Yeah, so LeadGenius is a B2B, business-to-business data vendor. So essentially, if a company you're in sales and you want to identify prospects that you're going to go after, getting that prospect's information like an email, the company address, how many employees they are, what technologies they're using, all of those data points were things that were curated and that we would provide to each of our clients at LeadGenius. So that's what we did there. And the initial question as far as...
Well, give me an example of yourself speaking with a prospect and what they might have been using at the time and how the kinds of questions you would either ask them or tell them to ask their current vendor to understand where the holes are in their current processes.
Yeah, so one example might be if we were going against somebody like a Discover.org, right? They've changed drastically since I was at LeadGenius, but at the particular time I was there, they were very focused on working with larger companies, and specifically in the verticals like for IT and technology. So they did a really good job of kind of mapping the organizations within those verticals. So if I was talking with a particular client that maybe like Zenefits that was going after more of the SMB space, and they were considering Discover.org, asking them questions about who their target audience is, what data points are they interested in gathering, and then, like I mentioned earlier, equipping them with just some questions that other prospects similar to themselves have mentioned, and making sure that you get X, Y, and Z.
What was your typical answer to when a prospect said, well, how are you better than Discover.org? Or how are you better than other competitors that I'm currently looking at? Because that's a question that's asked very often.
Yeah.
Especially in a new technology, right? Especially if Fortune 500 is looking at something that's never existed before, something super innovative, and they're trying it out for the first time. So it's virtual reality or self-driving cars or anything, or a new sales tool, a CRM in the cloud that people have never heard of before. And they're looking at 5 different options, and they say, all right, Cart, tell me, how are you better than the rest of the competition? How do you usually go about answering a question like that?
So typically at LeadGenius, the case was a lot of people provided basic level data. So when I say basic level, I'm referring to things like the company address, the contact, the title, their email, their phone. Like those are all sort of, I view them as table stakes. Really what differentiated us was our ability to provide custom data points. And so an example would be like whenever we were working with Indeed, they had an enterprise team that had been struggling, and we're looking at a few different potential data points that might be good indicators of where they should focus their time. And so ultimately having that discussion around, we landed on, in their case, it was looking at how many job postings a company had on a select number of job boards. They found that by using that, I can't recall exactly, it was something like they were able to increase their win rate on those between something like at least 10%.
By using this sort of non-standard
Yeah, exactly. That's another way of saying it. Non-standard data point, a custom data point. It's really, I kind of correlate it to, if you think about having an intimate understanding of your target audience and exactly who you should be going after. And on the flip side, it's like making sure to ignore all of the noise or prospects that would be disqualified potentially after several conversations.
Gotcha. You at LeadGenius, you spent a few years there, and you, very interestingly, you started off as an account executive, and then you made your way up to head the sales. How did the sales process change for you? Perhaps the general environment around which you were selling over the course of those few years that could be related to your own personal title growth, or that could be related to just the market or LeadGenius's name in the industry. Would love to kind of understand, for folks who are at early stage startups, what they can expect might change as they grow, both personally, the company itself, the entire environment within which the company exists. How did you see that happen in your growth from account executive to head of sales at LeadGenius?
Yeah, I mean, if you're at an early stage startup, a lot of the reasons that people join those is so that they can learn quickly in a fast changing environment. And so on that note, things changed drastically from when I joined as employee 7 and that was pre-Series A. the landscape changed quite a bit, because whenever I first joined there, really the only competitors on the market still were like at Dun & Bradstreet, Hoover's, and then over the course of a little over 4 years that I was there, that was right when there was an explosion of technology specific for sales that came onto the market, and along with that were a bunch of other data vendors, so like your ZoomInfos, your DiscoverOrgs, Data.com, and then a plethora of other ones that were just popping up. So it became a much more competitive landscape than it was initially. And internally, some of the changes that we saw, I mean, at first you think if you're on a team of 10 people, a lot of decisions are made quickly. As a group, you can yell across the room to the other person. You have each other's ear. And then as we raised our Series A, Series B, and started to expand, adjusting to some of the formalities of having a standing, something as simple as a standing sales meeting, or our monthly team huddle would change drastically. When you start at that early of a stage, everything can become a little bit, you're involved, wearing multiple hats, and then kind of coming to terms with, trusting the people that you're hiring, and then bringing it back and focusing on the core deliverables of your particular department, in which my case was focusing on sales.
I want to dive into that management of sales reps in a moment, but I'm also curious how the actual sales process changed. Perhaps what a conversation was like in the earlier days of LeadGenius when you joined as employee number 7 to the later days of LeadGenius a few years later when it was already a little more fundraised, some more competitors in the market. Mm-hmm. What either got easier or got harder about actually making a sale as the company grew?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the early days, it was pretty unstructured. Everybody was kind of doing their own thing. We didn't have a formal pitch deck, if you will. And as far as the qualification, we were at that point in time really on the lower end of the market, so working with a lot of startups, a lot of SMBs, and it would be pretty straightforward. It was as simple as kind of qualifying what their target audience is, who's the particular person that we're talking to, are they the decision maker? It was most often going to be a founder or a VP of sales, and then we would provide them with a small sample set. We did monthly contracts at that point in time, and then we were sending PDFs of the contracts over. That was the beginning.
Just whatever you had to do to make it quick, make it easy.
Yeah, and make it quick, make it easy. Even the contractual language, like we had lawyers, but in the early days, if somebody came back and wanted to have specific terms, it's something that we'd quickly go over, talk with one of the executives, and then go and make the change on the Word doc, convert it to a PDF, and start using that. So that was very different from later on. We built the product out a lot further, and then with the market being a lot more competitive, we had to really redesign the whole, like we would do a brief 15-minute discovery initially, and then from there actually having a formalized demonstration rather than just pitching to, in the early days it was one person that was making the purchase. There were a lot of stakeholders, and we saw a dramatic shift from it just being the VP of sales that was looking to purchase it to we'd have individual contributors coming through.
Why did that change? Was it that your product changed and now can fit into a larger enterprise, or people got smart? What changed?
I think it's probably more the latter, where as there is more and more technology available, then individuals are out there thinking about, there's this data vendor, that data vendor. Oh, my company doesn't necessarily have one in place. Okay, I know that I can go and look at one of these companies and purchase leads in a relatively affordable mean to help me achieve my target as an individual salesperson. So there was that piece, and then there was also we saw a lot of marketing folks coming in as well. So VPs of marketing or a CMO, and so oftentimes we would try to get multiple stakeholders, if you will, including the VP of marketing, your VP of sales. And then what we found was really important to have involved was actually somebody from the operations side of things.
So you yourselves began to identify that you might have an early call with a VP of sales, but you might tell her immediately, hey, we want to speak to your head of operations next, because it's going to be him who really begins to implement it. So you were able to guide that original prospect through their buying process a little more professionally?
Yeah. To guide them through the process in a more professional means, but then also to really ensure that it was going to be a seamless implementation. A lot of times we would have deals that would be held up because of that person in the operations department.
Because they were just booked up and couldn't handle it this quarter.
Yeah, or they had a bad experience with a particular vendor, or they didn't want to, they viewed it as a lot of work without understanding the value, and then if they weren't involved in the process at all, it could become a challenge. So those being some of the reasons to really focus on having the operations person involved. Something else that we found was early days we had a lot of churn was a problem. We were doing monthly contracts. The qualification wasn't terribly exhaustive. And what we found is then even if we met our minimum accuracy guarantees and provided the necessary volume of data that a particular client might want, they would go and they'd say that we didn't get any revenue from this. And so by getting that operations person in, what that really allowed us to do is further vet what is the current process. Because when you're providing somebody data, you can give them the best data in the world, but if that company that you're selling to doesn't have a defined methodical process of execution or executing on that, on working that data, then that's, at the end of the day, they're not going to continue to pay you if they're getting $0 at the end of the day. Yeah. So it was a lot of discussions around what is the target audience that they're going after? What's the cadence that you're using? Are these leads going to be worked by your account executives, or are they going to be worked by, do you have dedicated sales development representatives? What's the number of touches, emails, calls, are they being, later on, the account-based marketing or account-based sales started to come up more and more, so then diving into, what's a nurture strategy? And all of those questions
So you really became almost, perhaps consultants is the wrong word here, but you were trusted sales advisors holistically. To whatever client. You weren't just, here's a product, you put in a company, we give you the leads. You began to really look into your client sales process to make sure that they're looking at your product properly. Yeah, exactly. And what was really interesting is a lot of times when you're at companies, you'll have your ideal customer profile. And you think about that, and they have certain pain points that you speak to, and your product will have a certain value proposition. But one of the things that I loved about being being at LeadGenius and selling data was everybody's process and the niche that they were going after and how they were going after it was slightly different. And the best reps that we had were really well versed in how things should look at, say, if you're selling into the SMB, a higher velocity versus you're talking to a larger company that's selling a technical solution to IT for larger companies, how the sales org should be structured, and then what were the appropriate means of effectively working a given lead, number of touches, number of emails. Those things became really important.
and I think is what allowed us to win a lot of the times that we were going up against companies that, quite frankly, had a better interface, if you will, as in fancier, slick Salesforce integration. You can go in and search your leads.
Between things like LeadGenius and Zenefits, and then a lot of the work you've done with startups through programs like 500 Startups, where you're a mentor, what are some of the common objections that you recommend that either the salespeople or the CEO, whoever's leading the sales for an early stage startup, what are the common objections or types of objections that sales folks at startups get from larger companies, and how do you dig those out? I mean, you mentioned a fantastic one where you think, oh, we're selling to the VP of Sales. VP of Sales will be the person using our product, and then all of a sudden it turns out, well, the ops person said no, or the IT person said no, or the finance person said no, and so you begin to try to seek out those other objection givers early on.
Yeah.
What are some other objections that you saw come out often, and what are some tips or tricks or just questions or parts of your process that you've implemented either at Zenefits, LeadGenius, or recommended that other startups implement to begin understanding the possible fully exhaustive list of objections that they might be getting and tackling head on?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and so a lot of times, there's the initial objection, but I will always speak to my teams about making sure to dig deeper. And part of that is understanding what is truly what is that individual's pain point, the individual that you're speaking to, and then how does that fit into the business itself? Because we'll stick with LeadGenius almost on every single conversation. People would say, we need a Salesforce integration. It needs to be plug and play, seamlessly integrated. We didn't have that until halfway through my third year there. And so that's the initial objection, but oftentimes I found that initial objection is not the real pain point. So making sure to dig deeper, and if you understand what they're looking for, then you can sort of position your product accordingly. If the first thing that they come out the gate and say, like in the example I gave, that they need a Salesforce integration, just making sure to follow up and dig deeper and ask questions about. So great, totally understand that you're looking for a Salesforce integration. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Just to get some additional detail and context around, is that the real objection that they gave me, or is that just something, is that a nice to have?
So when you would get that objection, somebody would say, well, how's your Salesforce integration? You say non-existent, I'll call you in 2 years. Or rather, why wouldn't you say I'll call you in 2 years? Why was that not the end of the conversation? They said they needed a thing, you didn't have the thing?
Because ultimately it was like they would like a Salesforce integration. But once they realized that they were able to get access to data points that weren't readily available, and the data points that would influence either their conversion rate or their win rate, and allow them and their teams to focus on a particular audience, then that became way more important than having a slick Salesforce integration. So in the case of the example of Indeed, where being able to increase your team's win rate by 5 to 10%, that's meaningful. And so would I take, in their case, would they take that versus, or, a slick Salesforce integration? I think, where their decision fell.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's, oftentimes you'll get those upfront objections, or I don't have time, or we already have something in place, but it's really about having a conversation with somebody.
One of the cool things about starting early as a salesperson at a startup is that there's usually a product already built of some sort, and if not, then it's really exciting because you get to do a lot of asking people questions and then helping to build a product. But there usually is some sort of MVP built. You're selling some sort of product, you're getting into certain customers, and so there's two pretty cool things pretty cool interactions that the salesperson at a startup gets to have with the product team. The first is trying to figure out which market is the best for the product that already exists.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you might have built something, and while it's not for the best possible market, there is a market somewhere that you need to identify. But the second comes over time. The second comes, well, hey, turns out 90% of my people are saying Salesforce integration. It comes in when you say, hey, turns out if you're selling self-driving cars for groceries, you need some sort of cooling or temperature control. That's what everybody's saying. But if you sell that same product to a different market, there might be different priorities. For example, when we sell to the auto parts industry, well, temperature requirements aren't there at all. They got to make sure that greasy oil doesn't spill, right? Probably the same thing for LeadGenius. If you're selling to a developed Fortune 100 that's on Salesforce, fantastic. If you're selling to an SMB that's using an Excel spreadsheet as their CRM, it's different. So how do you think about how the person leading sales at a startup can interact with the product team, let's start with the latter. How do they interact with the product team as they're getting feedback from the market that they're going after and identifying where the future growth lies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something it's a critical piece of leading a sales organization, because you have the team underneath you and you're on the front line, so to speak, but all of that feedback that you get, you have to ensure that that's getting back to the product team. So working cross-functionally, just like you would working with your marketing peers to kind of refine the types of leads that you're getting. So like something that when I was at Zenefits that we actually did is really formalize that structure a little bit within our Salesforce instance. So actually having a product feedback section that was a part of our sales, kind of the later steps, similar to closed loss reasons, where it was both for closed loss deals as well as closed won deals. And it was a simple, you pick the product feedback, yes, then choose, there were some 4 or 5 options to start, but it was a pretty lengthy form that they would just quickly go through and say that this person was looking for time and attendance or a particular payroll feature that we didn't have. And then all of that feedback was easy to aggregate and visible. And it was something that not only the product team looked at, but the executives looked at, marketing looked at. It became the source of truth, if you will, and the real substance, meat and bones of a recurring meeting with the sales leadership and product on, okay, this is the product feedback, these are why we're winning, this is why we're losing, and so really making sure that they took that into account as they're building out the future roadmap.
And how does that play into focus? And that's probably perhaps a question even in the earlier stages. Zenefits, much larger company, you can sort of productize this question asking, this understanding what's missing from the product, and begin to send that over to the engineering team. But in the early stages, where it really is just somebody peeks into your head and says, "Hey, peeks into your room and says, "Hey, Carl, what should we be building? What should we be working on?" In many ways, it's up to you to decide what to focus on, where to go, and that should be guided on what you're telling your sales team they should focus on. Mm-hmm. So how do you think about in the early stages focus in terms of forward-looking focus? Well, hey, we're saying, I heard you give a talk before where you talked about total addressable market and total target market and really what you're going after and how niche you want to get, how you're dividing your time between your really dream customers versus kind of those a little more on the edge. So how do you think about structuring that focus for your team and also thinking about what you expect from your engineering team, which is also not as large as you want it to be, and that balance?
Yeah, it's a really, I think there's a lot of different variables to take into account when thinking about that. So one is looking at like really being truthful with yourself, as in like, was this particular feature, like, is this a one-off case where some company had some nuanced relegated system in place that led to this particular request, and it may have been a large deal, but how repeatable is that particular pain across the spectrum of your target audience. Because if you just go and are really vocal about every single feature that some customer told you lost to, like, it really makes it difficult to prioritize and do things that are going to move the needle for the group as a whole, if that makes sense. Because if you can't repeat the objection across multiple prospects, or then like, it's, again, even if it's a large deal, it's difficult to lose, but it's something that is going to fall lower on the priority list and maybe be something that isn't necessarily communicated. Now, if you're losing deal after deal and conversation after conversation, then it's something that you have a discussion with the VP of product or the executive team to really start to vet out, okay, like, what is on the docket currently? Like, this is how we're losing our deals. And the easiest thing that I've always found is, like, even in an early stage startup, quantifying things with data. So rather than just saying we lost that one deal and it was worth $100K if we had that and this feature, like, making sure to keep track when you're in your one-on-ones, doing deal reviews, and kind of coming up with your own structure for rating, say, for example, like the top 3 reasons that you're losing things, and then quantifying that. Just take it times the number of deals that your team closed lost over a quarter or a month, and your average contract value, and you go into a conversation, and instead of it just being like a reaction to one recently lost deal, you're able to actually go and speak to a larger trend and tie it back to a tangible lost opportunity.
Yeah, I think this point is so important because that's one of the most interesting parts about working at an early stage company, is that doing sales at an early stage company, is because you really get a voice over what's being built. Everything that's being built needs to be customer led. It should be vision led, but it should also be slightly customer led. And it's so easy to make a mistake, especially when you have small data sets, about what people are clamoring for. I think you said it really, really well, where, hey, if one customer says, hey, wouldn't it be awesome if you had this feature, or call me back when you do, you turn around and say, hey, engineering team, build this feature. Well, maybe you got lucky and that same customer had the same problem as a lot of others, but more than likely, one person just told you something on a whim, you go build it, they're not going to buy it anyway because they were just talking.
It's not the real reason.
I'll give you an example of when I did that poorly, and that could hopefully give you an opportunity to think for a moment about a product feature that you saw through being built off conversations you had with clients at LeadGenius or at Zenefits. I was working on a delivery company, and it was a traditional sort of, we had a two-sided marketplace. We were selling to restaurants and small businesses, and we were selling to drivers to get on our platform. I had an idea, and then I heard it from one driver. That would be fantastic if they could see a live update of all of their earnings in the app. So they had their driver app, kind of like an Uber app. It was around 2013 that we were doing this. And we wanted to put in live updates of how much money they made, plus we wanted to gamify the whole thing. So wouldn't it be awesome if a driver logs on, and we have to win drivers, right? We're trying to win drivers away from DoorDash and from Uber. Gamify the whole thing, see the leaderboards, it clears every week, say that, hey, this week if you drive this much, you'll win this much, and see where all the drivers rank. And our engineers spent, I had this idea and then heard it from a couple of drivers. Our engineers spent weeks building this thing out. It launches, nobody even looks at the page. Drivers just don't even, they're just trying to get paid and go home. And our target driver actually was not even doing enough hours to really compete. There was a lot of musicians, a lot of students, not full-time people like it is now with Lyft and Uber, who are spending 40 hours a week on it. So that was time poorly spent, where we didn't really listen to, I'll call them our customer. There were people we were trying to sell to join our platform. We didn't really listen to them. We just had an idea, heard it validated by one other person, confirmation bias, and we spent a lot of time and resources building it. And that was a lesson I won't forget, and hopefully have improved on, but it's so easy to do that when you have little data.
Yeah, especially like if you're on the front lines and it's you that lost the deal, and then that last deal causes you to miss your quota.
You're not having that product lost you 20 grand.
The initial reaction, and it's just human nature in all of us, is to like focus on that, and then like talking about how if we had this one feature, like, you know, we could sell, and you're sort of magnifying and amplifying the extent of the problem, but just taking time to remember that, again, like, is this something that you've seen before? And if you don't have the data yet, go and speaking with a few additional customers, or adding that as a question within the qualification or your sales process, in order to sort of validate that, like, oh yes, this is a feature that people in our target audience want, or a feature that they would not be willing to not move forward with a purchase if we don't get this.
Time has flown by, Cart. Believe it or not.
It has.
But it really has. I want to spend the last few minutes here understanding your thoughts on what's different about doing sales at a startup depending on the size. Zenefits is a very different company than LeadGenius.
Yeah.
There are different stages. Zenefits has raised a buttload of a lot more money more. It is more well known. It is a brand that large companies can trust. Whereas when you were at LeadGenius and when you work with 500 startups, you're working with very early stage companies. That trust doesn't exist. That 2-year plan, 3-year plan probably does not exist. Systems certainly do not exist. So when you think about leading a team, I'll ask 2 questions here. The first is, how do you think about hiring the team? What kinds of individuals are great sales folks in the very smaller companies versus at a more larger, slightly more established startup like Zenefits? My second question is, how do you guide that team? How do you establish your priorities? How do you speak to them? You're mentioning 15-minute sales check-in meetings. How do you have those conversations in smaller companies versus in larger sales organizations?
Yeah, well, step one in a smaller company is recognizing that you need to have some structure in place. One of the things that I learned at LeadGenius, and Ryan Williams is the person who kind of really taught me the framework of hiring, the importance of hiring, the importance of the process. That's the one thing that I would say is similar between the two, is even if you're at a startup, it's even more critical. If you're only 6 people and you're about to hire the 7th person, like, your runway to have somebody come in, you all spend months, and you're all spending resources of your time to get them up to speed, and then they go and walk, like that type of impact when you're at an early stage startup is really, really detrimental. Versus it's still painful and costly when you're at a larger company, but the stakes are just not as high. As far as the processes are different. I think the type of people that do really well in startups, like in sales, obviously hard work is a given. You have to be a hardworking individual. You have to be coachability is critical. Your willingness to learn. The difference between in startups versus a larger company is, like, a larger company, somebody that isn't as proactive, that's looking for more of a, like, I don't say for a sales development representative, like, I don't have a ton of experience and I would like to, I'm really looking to learn. Like, that works better at a larger company where you have a little bit more of an enablement program and onboarding program. Whereas at a startup, somebody that is going to be proactive is going to be generally a lot better, because you just don't you don't have the time to go and have an exhaustive onboarding, enablement, and career path that you're going to have at somewhere like a Google or a larger organization. So those types of folks that are hungry, that are curious and looking at, or interested in things beyond just their core responsibilities.
Does the person's experience level matter to you when you're hiring in the very smaller early stages? Or is just that curiosity, that hunger enough?
Their experience level.
Because on the one hand, you don't want to waste time and on somebody fully inexperienced teaching them how to have a conversation.
Exactly.
On the other, somebody very experienced costs you a lot of money.
Yeah, and so I mean, experience for me personally matters a little bit more when you're in an early stage startup, because like if I'm the first sales executive that they hired at LeadGenius, and then when we were going to bring on our next person, like we weren't speaking with anybody that really didn't have sales experience, and inside sales experience was really important. Just because, like in my case, I was doing medical devices, field sales. I had a territory in Western Pennsylvania, and we had to update our CRM once every quarter. And then making that transition to an inside sales model where it's a lot higher volume. Like you need to have a process in place. That's something that So we identified that and made sure to clarify and refocus our profile and who we were interviewing.
Gotcha. Cart, this has been a ton of fun. I want to jump for the last little bit here to some rapid fire questions, and I wish we could talk for another hour or two, but so be it. There's knocking on our door here. So a couple rapid fire questions. I'll ask them quickly. You can take as long as or as short as you want to answer them. You ready?
Yep.
All right, let's do it. Are there any sales or startup books that have been particularly helpful to you?
Any sales or startup books that have been particularly helpful to me? So never split the difference. It's not necessarily, like that is, I give that book to all new hires on my teams, whether you're entry level, have no sales experience, or you're a seasoned executive. I think there's some valuable takeaways in terms of negotiating, having a conversation, recognizing things like how you use inflection, how your tone is.
Your radio DJ voice.
Yeah, exactly. So that's definitely a book that I really enjoy.
That's awesome. Doug Landis actually also recommended that one, so very popular book apparently. What is the sale you are most proud of landing?
So the sale I'm most proud of landing it's a surgeon. It was when I was in medical devices. His name is Dr. Gruen, and so this individual was a level 1 trauma surgeon, which all that means is that, like, for the really bad cases and complicated fractures, like that's where they send them. And so this individual, he really didn't give me any time of the day, and in fact, when I happened to be in the room for one of the cases, kind of really laid into me and started asking me a bunch of questions, and questions way above and beyond what they gave us in training, like different surgical approaches, and I didn't know them. He sort of laughed at me, but then being able to then earn his trust over the course of the next 18 months, and he didn't do a lot of hip replacements. Like he would take those on the weekend, and then doing that, and it was a complicated procedure, and ended up like fracturing the stem, a spiral down, and kind of guiding him and his staff through what to do was the moment that I truly earned his trust and then earned his business. And we still keep in touch to this day. If I have friends that fracture something, like I'll send it over to him. And so that for me is definitely one of the most memorable ones, because one, it didn't start off great. It wasn't easy. And then two, the way that he interacted with me forced me to step my game up, and to a level that wasn't really necessary, but was above and beyond. I was a very knowledgeable rep and more knowledgeable than my peers. So then taking those learnings and being able to go and win more and more business.
I love that story, because it really is all about trust. People buy from people. Throw whatever trope you want out there, but that story covers it all.
Yeah.
What is a current startup or a current large tech company that you would have loved being the first sales hire for?
Outreach.io.
Yeah, tell me about them and why.
So they're an email automation platform, primarily for sales, but really they can be used across sales development, account managers. And so I was an early user of theirs at LeadGenius, and have implemented that at various companies that I've consulted with. And then also we implemented that at Zenefits as well. And it's a phenomenal company that continues to build. We talked earlier about focus and building the right things. And so they've done a great job they have a really robust product now. But I could, in the early days, it was a tool that allowed you to sequence prospects, and it had templates similar to a Yesware or a Toutapp, if anyone's familiar with the older tools. And now they've got a dialer functionality. They have a lot of tasks. They have seamless integration within Salesforce, and they continue to do a great job. And I think it really makes it is one of the key tools in a salesperson's arsenal, if you will, whether you're using them or a competitor. So I would have loved to be sales hire number one there.
I love that. Two final questions. One I love to ask is, tell me about an early mentor of yours and what you learned from them.
Early mentor. So one mentor, when I was at LeadGenius, and even earlier than that, I was thinking about what should I do, where should I go. I would overanalyze everything. And the one piece of advice that he gave me that I'll never forget is he told me to, one, stop worrying and just make a decision. Because at the end of the day, you are where you are because of you. And so regardless of the decision that you make, you will make it right. And that's something that, just when he said it to me, it took a while to sink in, but it really is, a lot of times we spend reflecting about whether or not you should join a company, or whether you should take on the manager role, or that you're on this particular path, and we're not making any decisions, and as long as you're not acting, you're stagnant.
Yeah, I actually just reached over to pull out this book. It's called Exhalation by Ted Chiang, and it's a series of short stories recommended by Obama and a bunch of other famous names. And the first story in this book is called The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate. And it's a beautiful story that I highly recommend, but the premise of it is there's a character in there that's able to go into the future and into the past, see things, interact with things, but no matter what series of decisions he or she makes when he gets to future or past, the time just continues to go as it did anyway.
Yeah.
You got to where you are based on decisions that you made, and you're only going to get to where you're going based on decisions you're going to make.
Yep.
Indecision is as much of a decision as any other decision. Being able to cope with that challenge is really difficult for many people, so I love that advice, and I also highly recommend this book, Exhalation by Ted Chiang.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out.
Well, where can people learn more about you, what you're doing next, and some of the work that you got coming out and you're teaching people about?
Yeah, so just LinkedIn. I'm always on LinkedIn, so looking me up there. I do some work with 500 startups, mentoring. So there's some videos there that you can check out. And if anybody wants to connect, just shoot me a message on LinkedIn, and we'll get together. I love nothing more than just talking shop and figuring out, there's a problem that you're having. And it's there's multiple solutions to it, but let's talk through different ways of thinking, and that's really how I think people really progress and move forward.
Awesome. Cart, thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, there you have it. Carthele Kelly, ladies and gentlemen. Disparaging your competition ruins trust. Never Split the Difference is a must read. And you should never call the baby ugly. you want to learn more about Carthele, you can find him on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Carthele Kelly. That's CARTHELE Kelly. If you like the podcast, leave us a review. If you didn't, tweet me at alubarski2, and it'll make it all better. Thanks. Happy selling.